Good evening, this is TalkSport 1089 and 1053 AM and across the United Kingdom on digital radio, also across Edinburgh, Fife and the Lothians on Talk 107. This is Duncan Barks in London and George Galloway is in South Lebanon. Let's get some more calls on air. George, let's go to Gary, who's in Birmingham. Gary, you're through to George.
Yeah, good evening, George.
Hi, Gary.
George, I've been listening to you for some weeks, and I want to try and give as rational as I can point over to you, because I'm not a supporter of what you do, but...
Okay, just be brief, Gary, because we've got a full switchboard.
Okay, George, what I'd like to ask you is this. Have you any intention of going over to Israel next weekend and doing your shows from the war area in Israel, from the schools and the government buildings and the hospitals that have been demolished in Israel? Have you got any intention, George, of going over there and giving people an idea of what it looks like over there?
Okay, Gary, thanks for that, and admirably brief. I did make this point last night, that I'm not welcome in Israel, but if the Israeli government wants to guarantee me safe passage, I personally would be delighted to do that, though it would probably be better, Gary, from your point of view, if somebody rather more sympathetic to the Israeli case were to do the show from there. But I certainly have no problem in principle with doing that. I have been in Israel many times. I've got many friends there. I've spoken at political rallies and meetings there. I've got no problem in principle about going. It's purely a practical reason. Now, the problem with what lies behind, I suspect, the point that you're making, is that the destruction in Lebanon is 30 times greater. That's 30 times greater than the damage in Israel. And the Save the Children Fund, I know that supporters of Israel don't like this being quoted because, well, it's unanswerable, really. The Save the Children Fund, patron Her Royal Highness the Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, no Hezbollah supporter, have told us that 45% of the more than 1,000 civilian dead in Lebanon that Duncan talked about at the beginning of the show were children. And, I'm still quoting, a substantial proportion of the others were women. In other words, the great majority of the more than 1,000 civilian dead in Lebanon are women and children. And anyone with eyes to see, except those too blind because they will not see, can see that Lebanon has been fantastically, devastatingly destroyed by the aerial bombardment. That is not true in Israel. The proportion of Israeli soldiers killed by Hezbollah as a total of the Israeli dead is the overwhelming majority. The proportion of Lebanese civilians dead as a result of the Israeli military action is overwhelmingly civilians. So I'm afraid on all counts, this story really is in Lebanon. But we're always delighted, Gary, and we've now had two in a row, to hear from supporters of Israel. And we always give them a fair crack of the whip on this show.
Okay, 08704 20 20 20 is the number. It is TalkSport 1089 1053 AM, also on digital radio and across Edinburgh, Fife and the Lothians on Talk 107. George Galloway in Lebanon, Duncan Barks in London, and Jeff is in Edgware. Oh. Jeff, you're through to George.
Hi, good evening. Good evening, George.
Yes, Jeff.
Hi, George. Yeah, you mentioned, I think during Ronnie's call about the Palestinian issue. One thing I wanted to ask you was, do you not see the fact that Israel giving up land which you call occupied, even though it had won it in a war which had been declared on it, do you not fail to see that actually is suicidal for Israel? It unilaterally disengaged from Gaza last year in a historically unprecedented move, and the result is not acceptance of Israel, but actually increased hostility to Israel and increased missile attacks. I mean, the town of Sderot has been under incessant fire attack. It's had about 3,000 missiles in a year, and it's ridiculous. Israel's fighting for its life, and you mentioned all the resolutions which are imposed on Israel by the United Nations. You don't mention the resolutions which are imposed on Lebanon to disarm Hezbollah. So you do offer somewhat of a jaundiced view of Israel, but that slightly detracts from my point. My main point being that you have to realise Israel is fighting for its life, and when you talk about concessions, all it's doing is inviting more hostility and violence from its enemy, who are simply committed to its destruction. You seem to excuse them. I'm not sure why, but they actually make no bones about the fact that they want Israel wiped off the map.
All right, Jeff, let's let George answer that, because we need to get as many people on air between now and 10. George.
Yeah, and certainly no one can say we're not being fair, Duncan. That's 3 supporters of Israel out of 3. So let me deal with the weasel words of Jeff, which most people will have picked up, but some might have missed. He says that I called the territories occupied. He said you called them occupied, even though they were taken in a war which was declared on it. Israel attacked its neighbours in 1967 and took these territories, as even Ronnie in Mill Hill, when he described it as a preemptive attack earlier in the programme, conceded. It's not me that says these territories are occupied. It's every government in the world, including the government of the United States, which is why the government of the United States has its embassy in Tel Aviv and not in Jerusalem, which Israel claims as its capital. Every government in the entire world, the United Nations, the Security Council, every international organization considers the land taken by Israel by force in 1967 to be illegally occupied territory. Worse than occupying it, Jeff, they have annexed. No. That is to say, for those who don't understand the word annexed, Israel declared that the Golan Heights was now not occupied territory, it was now a part of Israel. It declared that East Jerusalem was no longer occupied territory, but was a part of Israel. Now this international lawlessness, this rogue state behavior, has gone on for a long time, and you're right, it's been remarkably successful. You and others like you have been able to bleat about Israel fighting for its life, but increasingly that's not what it looks like to other people. It looks more like Israel choking your life.
That doesn't answer my question.
My overarching point is this, and I've made it 3 times already. You can go on relying on military force, or you can negotiate a settlement.
You haven't answered my question, George.
You really are
you haven't answered my question. You're being a politician. You haven't answered my question. My question was, Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza last year, and instead, from what you're saying, that should induce some kind of settlement. All it's done is increase attacks on Israel. Now, Jeff, how can you explain that?
Jeff,
how can you explain that?
You don't unilaterally withdraw from territory that you stole by violence and have held for 40 years. You comply with international law.
Call it what you want.
Put it to me.
Call it what you want.
Jeff, I'm speaking now. Jeff, I'm speaking now, and we can't both speak.
Call it what you want.
You cannot ask for the credit of withdrawing from a piece of land that you illegally occupied for nearly 40 years. In fact, if you were a criminal who came forward with goods they'd stolen 40 years ago, you would not get credit for handing them back. You'd get put in prison for stealing the money in the first place.
Answer the question, George. You're just an apologist for the Palestinians. Leaving
Yes, you're right, Jeff. Jeff, let's clear something up here, son. Let's clear something up here. You're an apologist for Israel, and I'm an apologist for the Palestinians.
You haven't answered my question, George.
I want you to be clear about this, and I want all the listeners to know this, although most of them will have worked it out long ago, 30 years ago, because for 30 years I've been fighting for the Palestinians. The difference, Jeff, is that once upon a time, most people thought like you, and very few people thought like me. Now, 30 years of experience has led the vast majority of people in our country to the conclusion that unless and until there is justice for the Palestinian people, the withdrawal of Israel from the occupied land and the creation of a Palestinian state, we're going to have war after war and act of violence after violence, some of it spilling over into our own cities. And we don't want it, Jeff. We no longer are prepared to give Israel the blank check that it was given in the past.
All right, Jeff and Edgewell, I'm going to move on. I don't want you to think you're being cut off, but it's only right and fair in this 2-hour show tonight that's going literally across the globe.